Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Be Like Christ for our Bible study. We are in Luke chapter 7, verse 29. In the last video, we talked about Jesus reaffirming and convincing the people that John was a legitimate servant of God. He wasn't the reed shaken in the wind. He wasn't the guy who was out there in comfortable clothing and having an easy ministry. He was a guy who stood firm on the message that God had given him to preach, much like the Old Testament prophets. We're picking up in verse 29 today, and Jesus is going to talk a little bit more about John and John's ministry and him and his own ministry and how they compare and the way people have responded to them. If you want a copy of the notes, there are links down in the description below for digital and hard copies. So let's read verses 29 through 30. When all the people heard this, that's the discussion about John that we just talked about. When they heard this, and the tax collectors too, they declared God just, having been baptized with the baptism of John. But the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected the purpose of God for themselves, not having been baptized by him. So it says, when all the people who had been baptized by John, who were in that crowd, when they heard Jesus reaffirming John as a genuine prophet of God, they, quote, declared God just. Now that's an interesting phrase. What exactly does that mean? I think the general idea is that they showed their approval for the work of God. They reaffirmed in their own minds and maybe even verbally that God had kept his promises, that there was this prophecy of a forerunner of the Messiah, and John was that guy, and they reaffirmed that again. And I think that's the idea. The common people and the tax collectors had submitted themselves to John's baptism, and in doing so, they affirmed that he was actually God's man. And here Jesus causes them to affirm it again. They testified to the justice of God in keeping his promises to send a prophet to prepare the way for the Messiah. We kind of already mentioned that. But in contrast to them, the regular people, the Pharisees and the lawyers had rejected John and rejected his baptism, and they refused to submit to it. And so here they continue to reject not only John, but Jesus. It's really one or the other at this point, right? I mean, Jesus here is affirming John, and so it's you either accept one or neither. Or you either accept both or neither. The King James Version and the ASV says that they rejected the counsel of God. Now let's read verses 31 through 35. This is the bulk of what we're going to cover today. And the Lord said, "Whereunto then shall I liken the men of this generation? And to what are they like? They are like children sitting in the marketplace and calling one to another and saying, We have piped unto you, and you have not danced. We have mourned to you, and you have not wept. For John the Baptist came neither eating bread nor drinking wine, and you say, He hath a devil. The Son of Man is come eating and drinking, and you say, Behold, a gluttonous man and a winebibber, or a glutton, or a drunkard, a friend of publicans and sinners. But wisdom is justified of all her children." Jesus addressed, quote, this generation in this section. And I think specifically what he means by that is the people that have lived during John's ministry and his ministry who have rejected John's message and his message. He says here that they wouldn't be satisfied no matter how God's message was presented, no matter how it was packaged. He compares these rebellious people, disbelieving people, to children playing with their companions. So paint this picture in your mind. Maybe you're in a village in Galilee. Down one of the alleys, there's some children playing, and some of the children are trying to figure out what they could do to get their companions to play with them. So what do first? Well, they play a happy melody, thinking that maybe their companions are in a good mood and they will all get up and dance. So they get their flute out and they play this happy melody, but their companions don't respond. So naturally they conclude, okay, they must not be in a happy mood. Maybe they're in a sad mood. And so they get out their instrument and they play a dirge or like a sad song, a song of mourning. Maybe, they need to weep about something and this will fit their mood. And the response of the companions is, again, no response, right? They don't respond to the happy song. They don't respond to the sad song. What's left at that point? So you've run the spectrum and still no response. Well, now take kind of that image, and Jesus takes that and he applies it to the response of the unbelievers who rejected both John and himself. So it was meant to illustrate their response. Jesus and John presented very differently. And even though they all taught the same truths, they presented them in very different style, I guess you could say. John preached the gospel while living apart from people. He lived, in the uncomfortable wilderness, eating locusts and wild honey. I don't know if you've ever seen a locust, but it's not something I'd really want to chow down on. So he was somebody who had a different diet than everybody else, lived in a different place than everybody else, and he preached about the kingdom of God. Now, Jesus, on the other hand, he preached the gospel while living among people in town, in Capernaum, traveling from village to village, and people following him around to these different places and hearing him talk. So he's living in town, and he was more than willing to stay in a house and to eat with people, regular food, not weird insects. So he was also, though, preaching about the kingdom of heaven. Two different styles, but some of the rebellious Jews had rejected the gospel preaching from both of them. They weren't open to the message no matter how it came packaged or how the messenger looked. So they mocked John for having a demon, probably suggesting that he was a crazy person. I mean, he lived out in the wilderness and ate weird stuff. So, who else would spend their time out there? So that's what they concluded about him. They wrote him off. They're like, that he's crazy. And then Jesus, on the other hand, who was, I suppose, partook in a few of more comforts than John did, lived among the common people. He got accused after eating meals with the sinners and the tax collectors of being a glutton and a drunk and someone who was indulgent. Now, both of those were ridiculous suggestions. John didn't have a demon, and Jesus wasn't a drunkard. But what you see here is that the people were taking, any feature that they could grasp onto about one of these guys and taking it to the absurd extreme and using that to discard the message that they were teaching. Nothing was good enough for them, and so they rejected it all, rather than actually listening to the messages that they taught. And I thought there's some application for this. Maybe in talking about these unbelievers who did this, maybe it reminds you of some people who perhaps you know or have come in contact to. Some people just are not interested in the truth, no matter how it's delivered. No approach is going to be effective to take with them because they don't have ears to hear. Truth is not their greatest priority. Sometimes you can go to somebody in love very gently and try to present something to them. And then you can go to them sternly with warning and fire and brimstone, and they're not interested in listening either way. Well, if you look at the ministry of Jesus, he recognized that, and he taught people the message and basically said, whoever has ears to hear this message can hear it. Right? But I'm presenting it this one way, and the truth seekers will come and find me, and those who aren't interested in the truth, they'll walk away. Both non-believers and believers can be this way, have this stubborn attitude, and refuse to believe the truth no matter how it's presented. Non-believers obviously can reject God and Christ without actually doing any fair evaluation of whether or not their claims are true. And then believers, though, can have their own religious biases, which keep them from hearing anyone else out and potentially putting on the table that they're their previous beliefs could be wrong and might need to be tweaked a little bit. So both can fall into this category. Another application. If somebody wants to reject God and the good news that God sent into the world, they will always be able to find a reason to do it. It doesn't have to be a good reason. It just has to be a reason that's good enough for them. And we kind of already talked about this ears to hear concept, but we've probably all met people like this. Kind of person who isn't interested in actually hearing what is said, only in responding to what you say. Person who assumes that they already know what you're going to tell them, or a person whose ears are hardened to certain messages because of past experiences. Some people like that are looking for reasons to reject the message, and they'll go to whatever extreme or whatever absurd solution to find a reason that's at least justifiable in their mind to reject what you have to say. So again, we need to pray that God sends us to people and brings us people who have ears to hear, and that's where the balance of our time needs to go, not in convincing people who are already biased towards rejecting Jesus. Okay, make sure not to skip over Jesus' that very last statement in verse 35 where he says, "But wisdom is justified of her children." That's kind of a strange statement. Matthew records a similar statement by Jesus in chapter 11, "Yet wisdom is justified by her deeds." So what was Jesus saying there? I think what he's saying is that the truth of his and John's message shouldn't be evaluated by picking apart the outward appearance of the messenger, but by an examination of the messenger's actions and life, by the fruit that they produce, by their deeds, by their offspring, right? What they produce, their children in a figurative sense. The Jews rejected John and Jesus because of their outer appearance. John looked crazy. Jesus didn't look like the Messiah who the Jews expected. And so they pretty much just wrote them off. But if they had actually taken the time to look at the evidence of their lives, the fruits that they were producing, the words that they were speaking, the claims that they were making, their inner goodness and godliness, then they would have realized that they possessed wisdom and that they were a source of wisdom. The Pharisees and the lawyers thought that wisdom could only be found in people that looked like them. Jesus was informing them that their system of evaluating a source of wisdom was very, very broken. So in application, before we judge someone as unwise or as someone who doesn't have anything to teach us or someone who we aren't going to devote our time to listen to, we need to look under the surface at what that person is producing through their life, through their words, through their actions, and evaluate whether or not they may have any wisdom to share with us. That's super important because if you're anything like me, you've gotten that calculation wrong so many times because you've just based it on outer appearance and surface level qualities. But if we do that, we're going to miss out on a lot of wisdom that comes from unconventional sources. And if the Bible teaches us anything, it's that wisdom often comes from unconventional sources. That's exactly what the Pharisees and Sadducees were learning here. Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Right? That was the response of one of the apostles. Is there anything that we can learn from that town? And he was saying it as in, that was definitely against the expectation. But yet, there was a good thing that had come out of Nazareth. And another application here as we close out, and that is that I think I'm going to summarize this rather than go with the way that my notes present it. When we think about sources of wisdom, and that we should look for those sources in wisdom with people whose deeds and actions and lives prove that they have something worth paying attention to. When our lives aren't going the way that we are expecting them to go, maybe God's leading us in a different direction and we don't know exactly what that direction is. and we're tempted to trust in our own wisdom and our own desires and our own direction rather than God's, then we need to come back to this evaluation of our source of wisdom and ask, okay, based on deeds, actions, goodness, and and track record, who should I trust, myself or God? Where's the wisdom to be found? If we're really going to evaluate things, being that wisdom is justified of her children, where should I look for wisdom? Is it in myself? How many times have my deeds not aligned with, the way that they should have, or been what they should have? How many times have I failed in goodness? And how often have I led myself astray? My track record's not looking too good, but God's is looking great. So who are we going to trust in that situation? There's reason to believe that God has the wisdom and to go with his route rather than trusting in ourselves and our own broken evaluation of what's best for us. So, maybe you're in a period in your life where you feel like you don't know exactly where you're supposed to be going or how you're supposed to be doing it or where God's leading you. I kind of am, my wife and I kind of feel like that right now. Trust that God's taking you somewhere you need to go, because he hasn't failed yet in directing his servants to become what he wants them to be and who they need to be. But I've definitely failed in my own directing of my life. So he will take care of it. He's got everything under control. Just trust him as the source of wisdom. Okay, we are done for today, and we'll pick up in verse 37 next time. See you guys later.